Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're diving into anger.
Ooh.
Yeah, we've got a lot of interesting material to cover today. From the movie Anger Management, there's actually some pretty interesting things in that movie.
Yeah.
We've also got some Islamic teachings about anger and
Oh, wow.
yeah, and we're also going to be looking at some stuff from South Park.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So our goal today is to kind of, I don't know, see if we can figure out what makes people angry, why some people get angrier than others,
Right.
and what we can do about it. So let's jump in.
Um, One thing that I think is really interesting is that when people think about anger, they often think about it as just being an emotion,
Right.
but it's actually a full body experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you know how when you're about to give a presentation, you start to feel your heart racing,
Mm-hmm.
your palms are sweating.
Yeah.
That's your body's fight or flight response kicking in.
Right.
And it's the same physiological reaction you get when you're angry.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. So it's really a full body thing.
It's not just in your head. I mean, there's some actual physical stuff happening.
Exactly. Hormones are being released.
Yeah. Your blood pressure's going up, all that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your muscles are tensing.
So I guess that makes sense then that one of the ways that you can start to deal with your anger is to recognize like what those physical symptoms are.
Absolutely. That's such a great point because, think about it. Sometimes you can experience that same kind of physiological response, even when you're excited about something good,
Right.
right? So being able to really tune into your body and notice those specific warning signs that are unique to your anger. That's like having your own internal alarm system. And it's telling you, hey, things are starting to heat up.
Okay, I like that analogy. So it's like if you know what your alarm system sounds like, then you can react quicker.
Exactly. The faster you recognize those signs, the better chance you have at choosing a different path instead of letting anger take over.
That makes sense. So, are there different ways that I guess anger can manifest itself?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are different types of anger. There's the explosive anger, like when you see someone yelling at a cashier.
Right.
And then there's the implosive anger, where someone might be quietly fuming inside.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not expressing it outwardly.
Right.
But maybe they'll end up taking it out on someone else later.
Right.
So, it's not always about how loud someone gets. It's really about how that anger is being channeled.
Yeah.
Whether it's outwards or inwards.
That makes sense.
And, one of the sources that we looked at that I think illustrates this really well is the movie Anger Management.
Oh, yeah, with Adam Sandler.
Yes.
And Jack Nicholson.
Exactly. It's a comedy,
Yeah.
but it actually has some really interesting insights.
Yeah.
Adam Sandler's character, Dave, is wrongly sentenced to anger management.
Right.
And he's led by Jack Nicholson's character, Dr. Buddy Rydell.
Yeah.
So they actually highlight this idea of explosive versus inclusive anger in the film.
Yeah. Okay, and I know I've seen the movie, but it's been a long time.
Uh-huh.
I know that, like, Jack Nicholson is playing this kind of off-the-wall character, but is there anything useful that comes out of that movie in terms of, like, actual anger management techniques?
Yeah.
Even if it's exaggerated for the sake of comedy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the movie does a good job of is showing how past experiences can contribute to our anger patterns.
Mm-hmm. Like how so?
Like, for example, Dave was bullied as a child.
Okay.
And that experience kind of fuels his anger issues as an adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I vaguely remember also that, like, he kept getting into these weird situations where he was getting in trouble for stuff that he didn't actually do.
Yes, exactly.
And it wasn't actually his fault.
Right, and that's another interesting point the movie raises.
Right.
Sometimes our perception of a situation can actually contribute to our anger more than the event itself.
Mm.
And, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but remember that final scene at the baseball game?
Yeah, vaguely.
Where it's revealed that a lot of these situations that were causing Dave so much anger were actually staged.
Oh, yeah.
As part of his therapy.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So it's like, wow, maybe we're all kind of creating these little anger-inducing movies in our heads sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to the power of our thoughts.
Yeah.
And the way we interpret things.
Right.
And how that can shape our emotional response.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, I'm thinking now back to times when I've gotten mad and I'm like, if I had looked at it from a different perspective, I probably wouldn't have gotten so mad.
Exactly. It's about perspective.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about, kind of the physical stuff that's happening. We've talked about how, we might be misinterpreting events. But the next source that we have is something totally different.
Oh.
This is some Islamic teachings about anger.
Okay.
And the thing that struck me from this is that the Islamic teachings seem to treat anger as something that can be powerful and can be used for good.
Right. It's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Because they talk about how there's this constant internal struggle between good and evil within each of us.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that can fuel anger is this idea of waswas.
Was.
Waswas. It's basically like these whispers from Shaitan that kind of tempt you and try to push you towards negativity.
Oh, okay.
So it's recognizing that, those whispers are there. But then you also have the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's teachings that provides guidance on how to manage that anger.
So is it wrong to feel anger from an Islamic perspective?
It's not about denying the feeling of anger. It's more about how you respond to it.
Okay. Yeah.
It's about, seeking refuge in Allah
Mm-hmm.
and choosing actions that are aligned with your higher self, even when anger is tempting you to do otherwise.
Okay. So are there any I guess examples or stories from the Islamic teachings that really highlight this?
There's this really powerful story about the Prophet Muhammad himself that demonstrates this principle of responding to anger with grace.
Okay.
So there was this one time when a Bedouin came up to the Prophet Muhammad and pulled on his cloak really rudely.
Oh, wow.
And demanded money. And instead of getting angry, the Prophet Muhammad stayed calm.
Mm-hmm.
And he instructed his companions to give the man some charity.
Wow, that takes some serious self-control.
Right. Talk about turning the other cheek.
Yeah.
But it's a really beautiful example of, how you can choose to respond to anger.
Okay, so that's like an extreme example.
Yeah.
But what about, us regular folks?
Right.
Who aren't prophets, who are just, dealing with daily annoyances and
That's
stuff.
where these practical anger management techniques come in, right?
Yeah.
One of the most effective things that you can do is to really understand the different ways that you can react to anger.
Okay.
Do you want to express it? Do you want to suppress it?
Okay.
Or do you want to calm it down?
Okay.
So it's really about having this toolbox of options
Right.
and choosing the right tool for the situation.
Okay.
And one really important skill is learning to express your anger assertively rather than aggressively.
Assertively. Okay. So what's the difference between being assertive and being aggressive?
So let's say your coworker keeps taking credit for your ideas.
Okay.
An aggressive approach might be to yell at them.
Right.
Or to put them down.
Yeah.
But an assertive approach would be to calmly and firmly address the issue directly.
Okay.
And to tell them how their actions make you feel.
Okay.
And what you would like them to do differently.
Yeah, so it's not about winning, it's about communicating.
It's about respecting yourself.
Yeah.
And respecting the other person.
Yeah.
And finding a solution that works for both parties.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And, sometimes that involves tapping into those calming techniques.
Okay.
Like we talked about before. Taking a time out, practicing deep breathing, maybe even using humor to diffuse the situation.
Okay, so we've talked about, expressing it assertively.
Right.
We've talked about calming it down.
Mm-hmm.
What about suppressing it?
That's a really interesting point because, sometimes suppressing anger can feel like the easiest option in the moment.
Right.
Especially if you're someone who's conflict averse.
Yeah.
But, while it might seem easier in the short term, bottling up those emotions can actually have really negative consequences in the long run.
Oh, okay.
So remember, we're aiming for healthy expression,
Okay.
not suppression.
Okay. So what if you've tried all these things? You've
Yeah.
tried expressing it assertively, you've tried calming yourself down, and you're still really struggling. Is it ever okay to just give into it?
I think there's a difference between giving in to anger and really understanding its root causes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes anger can be a sign of something deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there are some unresolved issues or past trauma that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And that's where professional help can be really valuable.
Okay, so even if you're doing all the right things, there might be some stuff underneath that you need to kind of unpack.
Exactly.
Okay, well that's good to know. So we've talked about movies, we've talked about the Islamic teachings,
Hmm.
and now for something completely different, we're going to talk about South Park.
Okay.
So this is from an episode where Eric Cartman, who is like the epitome of uncontrolled anger,
Right.
he goes to anger management therapy.
Oh, wow.
And it's hilarious, because he remains completely unfazed by insults and provocations, during the therapy session. But then he totally loses it.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
When he finds out something that his mother did.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously a comedy,
Hmm.
but it actually illustrates this really important point
What's that?
that, sometimes anger can be triggered by these really deeply rooted issues that we're not even consciously aware of.
Mm.
And that sometimes, a little bit of laughter can be the best medicine.
Yeah,
Even when you're dealing with a complex topic like anger.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we've looked at all these different sources, and it's pretty clear that anger is more than just a feeling. I mean, it's this physiological response. It's tied to our past experiences.
Right.
It can have this spiritual dimension to it.
Yeah,
And it can even be funny sometimes, depending on how you look at it.
it can be, yeah.
But the real question is, what do we do with all of this knowledge?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
How do we take all these insights and turn them into actionable steps for managing our own anger?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're going to be diving into next. Okay, so we've got a pretty good idea of like what anger is, where it comes from.
Right.
But now, like, what do we do about it?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
We've got all these different techniques. We've got this toolbox, but where do we even start?
Right, yeah. What's step one?
Well, I think step one is always self-awareness.
Okay.
It's like learning a new language.
Okay.
You can't form sentences until you understand the basic vocabulary.
Right.
And in this case, the vocabulary is your own personal anger patterns.
Okay, so like how does my anger usually show up?
Exactly.
Okay.
What are your triggers? What
Yeah.
what are those early warning signs we were talking about before?
Like the clenched jaw,
Exactly.
the racing heart.
Mhm.
Okay.
That kind of thing. The faster you can recognize those signals, the more time you have to choose a different response.
Okay.
And that's where those calming techniques that we talked about come in.
Right. So let's say I'm starting to feel those signals. What do I do? Like, should I just walk away?
Taking a time out can be incredibly effective.
Oh, okay.
It's like hitting the pause button on a movie.
Right.
It allows you to step back from the heat of the moment and regain some perspective.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But what if walking away isn't really an option? Like, what if I'm in the middle of a meeting or I'm having a conversation with my spouse or something?
Right. And those situations, those other calming techniques that we talked about can be really helpful.
Okay.
So things like deep breathing exercise.
Deep breathing. I've always kind of been skeptical of that.
Yeah.
It seems too easy.
I know, it seems so simple, right?
Yeah.
But there's actually a lot of science behind it.
Okay.
When you take a slow, deep breath, you're actually signaling to your body that it's safe to relax. It's like you're flipping a switch
Okay.
from that fight or flight mode to rest and digest.
Okay, interesting. So deep breathing, taking a time out if I can. Are there any other quick thing that I can do in those moments?
One technique that I find particularly helpful is cognitive reframing.
Okay, cognitive reframing. I've heard of that, but what exactly does that mean?
So it's essentially about challenging those negative thoughts that often fuel our anger.
Okay.
So for example, instead of thinking this person is deliberately trying to annoy me,
Right.
you might try thinking, well, maybe they're just having a bad day.
Okay, so you're trying to look at it from a different perspective.
Exactly. You're
Ah,
choosing a more compassionate or understanding interpretation of the situation.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're excusing bad behavior,
Right.
but it can help you detach from that initial surge of anger.
I like that. So it's like taking back control of the story you're telling yourself.
Exactly. You're reframing the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
And sometimes a little humor can go a long way, too.
Yeah.
It can help diffuse tension and remind you not to take things too seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned humor because I immediately think back to that South Park episode.
Uh-huh.
And I wonder, if Cartman with with all of his angle issues, he could probably benefit from some of this stuff.
Perhaps. But it's also important to remember that anger, while it's often portrayed in a comedic light,
Right.
it can sometimes be a symptom of something deeper.
Right. Like we were talking about before, sometimes it's a sign that we need to go talk to a professional.
Exactly.
Some help.
And that's not a weakness.
Right.
It's about taking care of your mental and emotional well-being.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we've got a good handle on all these techniques.
Yeah.
But I keep thinking back to that Islamic perspective on anger and how it can be used for good.
Right.
How do we actually do that? How do we channel that energy in a positive way?
That's such a great question. Because it really is about recognizing that anger itself isn't inherently bad.
Okay.
It's a form of energy.
Okay.
And like any form of energy, it could be harnessed.
Okay.
It could be directed.
So it's not about getting rid of it. It's about what you do with it.
Exactly. You're transforming it.
Okay.
And, in the Islamic teachings that we're looking at, they really emphasize things like seeking refuge in Allah and practicing forgiveness as ways to kind of transcend that anger. It's about aligning your actions with your higher self, even when you're being provoked.
Right, right. That all makes sense to me, but it's like, how do you actually do that? It's one thing to say transform your anger.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to actually do it.
It definitely takes practice, but one way to start is to just ask yourself, what is this anger trying to tell me?
Okay.
Is it pointing to some injustice that needs to be addressed? Is it highlighting a boundary that needs to be set?
So instead of just getting lost in the emotion itself, use it as like a guidepost.
That's a great way to put it, like a compass.
Yeah, okay.
So, for example, instead of yelling at the person who cut you off in traffic,
right.
maybe that anger could fuel you to advocate for safer roads in your community. Or maybe it could inspire you to finally start that project you've been putting off.
Or have that tough conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anger can be a catalyst for change.
Okay.
Both internally and externally.
So it's really about shifting your perspective and looking at it as an opportunity.
Exactly. It's about harnessing that energy and directing it towards something meaningful.
I like that. Instead of being afraid of it, you're respecting its power.
Yes.
And using it for good.
And that's a concept that I think is often overlooked.
Yeah.
We're so focused on managing anger and controlling it that we forget that it can also be a source of strength.
Right.
And motivation.
Yeah. This is really making me rethink my whole relationship with anger. It's not this thing that I have to avoid or suppress. It's a part of who I am, and it actually can be a good thing.
That's a beautiful insight.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that even our most challenging emotions can hold these valuable lessons.
Yeah.
And opportunities for growth.
So we've really gone deep on this anger thing.
We have.
The science, the psychology, the spiritual side, even pop culture.
Right.
But I keep coming back to this idea of anger as energy. It's not just about controlling it. It's about what you do with it.
Yeah, it's like we've been given this raw power and we get to choose.
Right.
Do we let it burn us or do we forge something new with it?
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And we've talked about, channeling anger into positive action.
Right.
Into advocating for change, but it also feels personal. Like this energy can actually transform us from the inside.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Think about the word passion.
Okay.
It can mean intense love.
Right.
But also intense anger. What if they're just two sides of the same coin?
Okay.
That raw energy pushing us toward what matters most.
I like that. Yeah. So instead of trying to, squash my anger, I could ask myself, what am I this passionate about?
Yeah.
What change am I being called to make?
Exactly.
Even within myself.
Yeah, anger could be a signal that something's out of alignment. Maybe a boundary's been crossed or a core value is being compromised.
Okay.
It's urging us to pay attention.
Right.
To take action.
So it's not the enemy, it's a messenger.
It is.
But how do we learn to listen to it without letting it, take over?
Right.
It's like I want to use the fire, not get burned by it.
Exactly. And it's a delicate balance.
Right.
And it takes practice.
Yeah.
One thing that helps me is remembering that anger is often a secondary emotion.
Okay.
Like the tip of the iceberg. And underneath might be hurt, fear, frustration.
Okay.
Addressing those underlying feelings can sometimes really lessen the anger's intensity.
So it's like you're peeling back the layers. Anger's the loud, demanding one.
Right.
But there might be these quieter, more vulnerable emotions underneath that need attention too.
Absolutely. And that's where self-compassion comes in.
Okay.
It's so easy to beat ourselves up for feeling angry.
Right, yeah.
But what if we treated ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend? If a friend came to us and said they were struggling with anger, We wouldn't just tell them to stop being angry.
Right.
We would try to understand what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's a good reminder for all of us.
Yeah.
You know, we're all works in progress.
Right.
We're all learning to navigate our emotions.
Yeah.
There are going to be times when we handle anger well and times when we don't.
Right.
It's about progress, not perfection.
This has been really eye-opening. I feel like I have like a whole new perspective on anger.
I'm so glad.
It's not something to fear. It's a part of me.
Yeah.
And I can choose how to use its energy.
And that's the most empowering takeaway, I think.
Yeah.
You have the choice.
Right.
You have the power.
Mm-hmm.
And with practice, you could become a master of your own emotional landscape.
I love that.
Yeah,
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
we have.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, remember, anger is a human experience.
It is.
It's okay to feel it.
Yeah,
But how you choose to respond is what really matters.
absolutely. And maybe next time you feel that anger rising up,
Yeah.
instead of pushing it away, just try asking yourself,
Okay.
what is this trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
What can I learn from this?
Right.
And how can I use this energy to create positive change?
That's a challenge I'm willing to take on.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.